The jungle on the island of Peleliu was not a place. It was a living, breathing entity, and it wanted them dead. For the men of the 1st Marine Division in September 1944, every tree, every vine, every shadow was a potential source of sudden, violent death. The heat was a physical weight, the humidity so thick it felt like breathing water. But the heat was not the enemy. The enemy was a ghost in the green, a whisper of death that announced itself only with the sharp, distinctive crack of a Japanese Arisaka rifle, followed by the soft, wet thud of an American Marine falling to the ground. For 3 days, 1st Platoon had been pinned down, unable to advance more than a few yards. The sniper was a master. He was invisible. He was patient. He never fired twice from the same position. He targeted medics, radio operators, and officers with chilling precision, crippling the platoon's ability to function. The Marines were terrified. They were trained for brutal, close-quarters combat, for charges and grenades. They were not trained for this. They were being hunted by a phantom they couldn't see, a specter that was slowly, methodically, bleeding them dry. Sergeant Herman, Sarge, Wallace watched the frustration and fear gnaw at his young Marines. At 35, Wallace was an old man in a young man's war. He was quiet, lean, and had the calm, steady eyes of a man who had spent a lifetime looking at distant horizons. Before the war, he hadn't been a soldier. He'd been a farmer and a nationally ranked competitive marksman from rural Pennsylvania. He understood rifles not as tools of war, but as instruments of absolute precision. He had tried to solve the sniper problem the conventional way. He sent out fire teams to lay down suppressive fire, hoping to flush the Japanese shooter out. The jungle simply swallowed the bullets. He had called for a mortar strike on the suspected area. It had only resulted in a lot of shredded vegetation and an unnerving silence, broken an hour later by the crack of the Arisaka and another Marine falling. The platoon's lieutenant, a fresh-faced 22-year-old, was at his wit's end. He looked at Wallace. "Sarge, what do we do? We can't stay here. We can't move." Wallace took a long, slow breath. "Sir," he said, his voice a low rumble, "let me try." "Try what, Sarge?" "We've tried everything." Wallace didn't answer immediately. Instead, he crawled back to his foxhole and retrieved a long, canvas-wrapped object. He unwrapped it with the care of a surgeon preparing his instruments. It was not the standard issue M1 Garand that every other Marine carried. The Garand was a masterpiece of engineering, a semi-automatic rifle that could lay down a high volume of fire. It was the weapon that was winning the war. Wallace's rifle was an antique by comparison. It was a Springfield M1903 bolt-action rifle, a relic from the First World War. It was slower, holding only 5 rounds to the Garand's 8. To the young Marines, it looked like their grandfather's hunting rifle, but it was what sat on top of the rifle that drew their stares and their smirks. Mounted on the Springfield was a massive, strange-looking telescopic sight. It was a Nerdle 8X scope, a long, gleaming tube of brass and steel that ran nearly the entire length of the rifle's action. It was not a standard military-issue scope. It looked like something from a science fiction magazine. One of the younger Marines, a private named O'Malley, couldn't help himself. "What in God's name is that, Sarge? Your Sears and Roebuck special." Another Marine chuckled. "Looks like Pop's old deer rifle." The mockery was quiet, but it was there. In their world, uniformity was safety. The standard issue Garand was trusted, proven. Wallace's rifle was an oddity, a mail-order special. It was a symbol of an old-fashioned way of fighting, a slow, methodical approach that seemed out of place in their fast, brutal war. The lieutenant looked at the rifle with skepticism. "Wallace, you really think that thing's going to do any good?" "Sir," Wallace said, his voice flat, ignoring the others, "the Garand is a fine battle rifle, but it's a hammer. We don't need a hammer. We need a scalpel." He patted the stock of his Springfield. "This is a scalpel. I can't see him with my eyes, and you can't see him with your Garand's iron sights. But with this," he tapped the big unearthly scope, "with this, I can reach out and count the hairs on a gnat's ass at 600 yards. If he's up there, I'll find him." The lieutenant was desperate. He looked at the faces of his exhausted, terrified men. He looked at the quiet, unshakable confidence in the old sergeant's eyes. "All right, Sarge," he said finally. "You're on. But be careful. He's already taken 3 of our guys." Wallace just nodded. He didn't need the warning. He knew the enemy he was about to face. This wasn't going to be a battle. It was going to be a duel, a contest of patience, skill, and spirit between 2 masters of the same deadly art, separated by a few hundred yards of impenetrable jungle. As he crawled to a forward observation post, a rocky outcrop that offered view of the dense canopy, he heard O'Malley whisper to his friend, "$10 says the ghost gets him before he even gets a shot off." Wallace ignored him. The mockery didn't matter. All that mattered was the weight of the rifle in his hands, the cool kiss of the steel against his cheek, and the hunt that was about to begin. The world for Herman Wallace shrank to the circular view inside his unnurdle scope. Everything outside that small, magnified circle ceased to exist. The heat, the flies buzzing around his face, the nervous whispers of his platoon, it all faded into a distant, irrelevant hum. His breathing slowed. His heartbeat, once a nervous thrum, settled into a slow, steady rhythm. This was his element. This was a hunt. He wasn't looking for a man. That was a rookie mistake. A man could hide. A man could become invisible. Wallace was looking for mistakes. He was looking for the tiny, unnatural details that betrayed a human presence. A broken twig, a patch of leaves that was too uniform, a shadow that didn't quite belong. His unearthly scope wasn't just a tool for aiming. It was an 8-power reconnaissance device. It allowed him to dissect the jungle 1 leaf at a time. The Japanese sniper he was hunting was a master of his craft, a disciple of philosophy entirely different from the American one. An American sniper was a marksman, trained to kill from a distance. A Japanese sniper was a ghost, trained not just to kill, but to terrorize, to demoralize, to become one with the terrain. They would tie themselves into the tops of palm trees, remaining there for days, subsisting on rice balls and a canteen of water. They used smokeless powder and flash hiders, making their position nearly impossible to spot. They were patient. They were disciplined. They were fanatical. Wallace knew this. He was not hunting an amateur. He was hunting an artist. Hours passed. The sun crawled across the sky, its heat intensifying. A bead of sweat traced a path down Wallace's temple, and he resisted the urge to wipe it away. Movement was death. He scanned the dense wall of green in front of him, a slow, methodical grid search. Left to right, top to bottom. Nothing. He repeated the process. Again, nothing. He could feel the impatience of the men behind him. He could imagine their thoughts. The old man is wasting his time. The ghost is gone. But Wallace knew better. The sniper was still there. He could feel him. It was a strange primal intuition, a connection between 2 predators. And then he saw it. It wasn't a man. It wasn't a rifle. It wasn't even a glint of light off a lens. It was a single leaf about 200 yards out, halfway up a massive banyan tree. And it had trembled, just a tiny, almost imperceptible shiver. But it had moved against the faint, prevailing breeze. There was no wind in that spot. Something had touched it. A hand? A rifle barrel? A breath? Wallace's heart gave a single, hard thump. He had him. He slowly, deliberately, swung the heavy barrel to Springfield, the movement so infinitesimal it was almost undetectable. The crosshairs of his scope settled on the area around the leaf. The magnification was so powerful he could see the individual veins on the leaves, the texture of the bark. And there, tucked into a deep V where 2 large branches met, was a patch of shadow that was just a little too dark, a little too solid. It was a perfectly constructed sniper's hide, a nest woven from local vegetation. The sniper was inside, completely concealed. A shot into the nest would be useless, likely to be deflected by the branches. He had to wait for the ghost to show himself. Another hour crawled by. The jungle was silent. Wallace became a statue, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. His breathing was so shallow it barely stirred the air. He was locked in a battle of wills with an enemy he couldn't see. And then a flicker of movement. A small field scope, a periscope, was slowly raised from the top of the nest. The sniper was checking the American lines, looking for his next target. Wallace now knew exactly where the man's head was. He didn't aim for the periscope. He aimed a few inches below it. He let out half a breath and held it, the technique practiced 10,000 times on ranges back home. The crosshairs settled on the dark patch of leaves. The world became silent. He didn't pull the trigger. He willed it to fire, applying slow, steady pressure until the rifle decided to break the stillness. The Springfield barked, a deep, authoritative boom that was completely different from the sharp crack of the Arisaka. It was a sound of thunder answering lightning. For a moment, nothing happened. The jungle remained still. O'Malley, back in platoon's position, started to whisper. He missed. And then a section of the sniper's nest seemed to convulse. A rifle, an Arisaka with a scope, fell from the tree, tumbling end over end until it clattered onto the jungle floor. It was followed by a limp, ragdoll form, which caught on a lower branch and hung there, swaying gently. The ghost was gone. A collective, audible sigh of relief went through platoon. Men who had been huddled in their foxholes for 3 days stood up, stretching, their faces a mixture of awe and disbelief. O'Malley was silent, his $10 safe, but his certainty shattered. The lieutenant crawled over to Wallace's position. He looked through his binoculars at the dead sniper hanging in the tree. He looked at Wallace, who was already calmly working the bolt of his Springfield, ejecting the spent cartridge and chambering a new round. He looked at the big, strange, mail-order rifle. "Sarge," the lieutenant said, his voice filled with a newfound respect. "I'll be damned." Wallace just nodded, his eye already back on the scope, scanning the opposite ridge. "He won't be the only one, sir," he said quietly. "This island is full of them." The mockery was over. The duel had been won. But for Sergeant Herman Wallace and his stupid rifle, the war on Peleliu had just begun. The word spread through the company like wildfire. Sarge Wallace, the quiet old-timer with the deer rifle, had taken out the ghost. The effect on morale was electric. The spectral, almost supernatural aura of the Japanese snipers had been broken. They were not invincible spirits. They were men, and they could be killed. Sergeant Wallace, overnight, went from being a curiosity to being a legend. The men no longer saw his Springfield as a mail-order special. They now saw it for what it was, a precision instrument in the hands of a master. But Wallace had no time for legends. He knew his first kill was not an end, but a beginning. The battle for Peleliu was turning into a nightmare. The Japanese commander, Colonel Nakagawa, had abandoned the standard doctrine of defending the beaches. He had turned the entire island into a fortress, a labyrinth of interconnected caves, pillboxes, and fortified positions dug deep into the island's jagged coral ridges. The fighting was a brutal, inch-by-inch grind, and a key part of Nakagawa's strategy was a widespread, systematic use of snipers to bleed the advancing American Marines. The next day, the platoon was tasked with advancing up a new ridge, a spine of jagged coral and dense vegetation the Marines had grimly nicknamed Bloody Nose Ridge. As they moved, the familiar, terrifying crack of an Arisaka echoed through the trees. A Marine at the front of the column fell, clutching his chest. The platoon scrambled for cover. The advance halted before it had even begun. This time, there was no hesitation. The lieutenant didn't send out fire teams. He didn't call for mortars. He just looked at Wallace. "Sarge, your show." Wallace was already scanning the terrain. The shot had come from their right flank, from a dense thicket of trees, about 300 yards away. He set up his position, his movements economical and precise. He didn't just look for the sniper. He began to think like him. Where would I be? Where's the best cover? The best field of fire? He dismissed the obvious spots. The high branches, the clearly visible rock formations. This sniper, like the last, would be clever. He would be hidden in plain sight. He focused his scope on a seemingly insignificant feature, a large fallen log, covered in moss and ferns. It looked like part of the landscape, but Wallace noticed that a small section of the moss seemed disturbed, just slightly out of place. He watched it. For 30 minutes, there was no movement. The platoon waited in tense silence. Wallace was a statue. Then, a small, dark hole, no bigger than a silver dollar, appeared in the side of the log. It was a firing port, cleverly disguised. The sniper was inside the hollow log. Wallace smiled grimly. It was a brilliant position, but he had found it. He didn't have a clear shot at the sniper himself, only at the small firing port. He would have to thread the needle. He settled in, his cheek welded to the stock of his rifle. He waited. He knew the sniper would have to expose himself, even for a moment, to take another shot. 10 minutes later, the dark hole of the firing port was momentarily blocked by the shape of a rifle barrel and a sliver of a human face. It was the moment Wallace had been waiting for. The Springfield roared. The sound of the bullet striking the log was a dull thwack. For a moment, it seemed like he had missed, that the heavy log had absorbed the shot. But then, the Arisaka rifle slowly slid out of the firing port and fell to the ground. There was no other movement. The sniper in the log was dead. Wallace had made an impossible shot, firing a .30-06 round through a tiny opening at 300 yards. 2 kills. The platoon advanced. 2 days later, Wallace was credited with 3 more kills. He picked off a sniper hidden in the mouth of the cave who had been harassing a machine gun team. He eliminated another who had tied himself into the top of a palm tree, a classic but deadly position. His 5th kill of the day was the most difficult. The sniper was in a fortified bunker, firing from a narrow slit. Wallace couldn't get a direct shot, so he did something that demonstrated his profound understanding of ballistics. He aimed not at the slit, but at the rocky outcrop just above it. His powerful .30-06 round struck the rock and ricocheted downwards, a spray of lead and rock fragments funneling directly into the firing slit. It was a bank shot, a piece of battlefield geometry that was as brilliant as it was deadly. By now, Wallace's reputation had reached the company commander. He was officially relieved of his duties as a platoon sergeant and designated as the company's counter-sniper. His mail-order rifle was now a recognized vital asset. The Marines, who had once mocked him, now treated him with a kind of reverent awe. They made sure he always had the best position, the first canteen of water, the extra rations. Their survival, they knew, often depended on the quiet old man and his thunderous rifle. The story of Wallace's rifle is a story of personal initiative and a friction between the individual and the institution. The Springfield M1903 he carried was not just an old rifle. It was his rifle. He had purchased it himself before the war. He had spent thousands of hours with it on the target range. He had customized it, tuning the trigger, glass bedding the action, and hand-loading his own ammunition for optimal accuracy. He knew its every quirk, its every idiosyncrasy. The unertl scope was also his personal property, a high-end piece of equipment far superior to the standard, fragile scopes the military issued. In an institution that prized uniformity above all else, Wallace's insistence on using his own non-standard equipment was an act of rebellion. It had likely caused him problems with his superiors in the past. But here, on Peleliu, where the standard equipment and standard tactics were failing, his personal expertise and customized weapon were proving indispensable. He was the right man with the right tool in the right place at the right time. Over a period of just 4 days, Sergeant Wallace was credited with killing 11 confirmed Japanese snipers. 11 ghosts. 11 artists of death. Each one a master of camouflage and terror. Each one systematically hunted down and eliminated by another, greater master. He had single-handedly broken the back of the sniper threat in his sector, saving countless American lives and allowing the advance to continue. Sergeant Herman Wallace's 4-day war against the snipers of Peleliu was a masterclass in marksmanship, patience, and tactical thinking, but was also a physically and psychologically draining ordeal. Each duel was a high-stakes battle of nerves, a silent, deadly contest that stretched on for hours under a brutal sun. The intense concentration required to scan the jungle for hours on end to pick out the smallest unnatural detail was exhausting, and the act of killing, even at a distance, took its toll. Wallace was not a man who reveled in death. He was a craftsman performing a grim but necessary task. Each time he squeezed a trigger, he was acutely aware that he was ending a life, even if it was the life of an enemy who was trying to kill him and his men. He did it with a professional detachment, but not without a cost. His success highlights a critical lesson of warfare, the immense value of the specialist. In the broad, chaotic machinery of war, the individual expert can have a disproportionate impact. While the main force of the Marine Corps was a sledgehammer, designed to smash through enemy lines, Wallace was a scalpel, precisely excising the tumors of resistance that were paralyzing the larger body. His 11 kills in 4 days were not just numbers on a scoreboard. Each sniper he eliminated was a source of terror and attrition that could pin down a platoon of 40 men. By removing them, he didn't just save the lives of the men who would have been shot. He enabled the entire company to move, to fight, and to achieve its objectives. He was a force multiplier one. His story also serves as a powerful argument against the rigid institutional mindset that often stifles innovation. The Marine Corps, like any large military organization, relied on standardization. Every Marine was issued the same rifle, the same equipment, and taught the same doctrine. This was essential for logistics and training on a massive scale. But it also created a system that was slow to adapt to unique challenges.